So we're back again with Professor Larry Rasmussen, who is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor Emeritus of Social Ethics at Theological Seminary. Professor Rasmussen, in part one you were talking about, on the one hand, the inescapable reality of differentiation, that nature itself, the universe as such, as it were, is constantly creating, and that in some fundamental sense perhaps differentiation is just part of being human, and therefore we see it in different religious traditions, larger and smaller, and that the challenge is how the challenge has always been, and in the past and will continue to be, how do we see beyond the differences and somehow see the other as oneself, as it were, to love thine enemies and to turn the other cheek. So a question that, in keeping with that I have in general, which I'd like to pose to you today, of course, is we are at an unusual moment in history. Many are arguing, and I feel the same way, in that we have this incredible confluence of different religious traditions and peoples of different ethnic backgrounds and what have you, coming together. And just to think about New York, it's this remarkable melting pot, as they call it. So it affords us a lot of opportunities for people of various backgrounds to discuss and to learn from one another. So I was hoping you could comment a little bit on the role that the historic larger traditions have had in terms of both shaping our consciousness today, both in the West and the rest of the world, as it's sometimes unfortunately put. But, and how can we learn from one another so that we can then apply it to some of our situations today?
Yes, I wish I knew. What happens is that in this so-called melting pot, things don't usually melt. I mean, the presence of different groups of people can still be as intense, living next door to each other, and with boundaries between them and differences among them. Just the proximity of being in each other's presence doesn't necessarily mean that they will get along, or they might get along on a common project, a common cause for something that they share, but then retreat into their rather self-enclosed worlds. So it isn't even having a common experience that necessarily fosters changed relationships between groups of people. And I think what you described is the setting that it is quite dramatic now, partly because of just human numbers. We were 1.6 billion human beings in 1900. That flipped in 2000. We were 6.1 billion. And it only took a decade to get up to 7 billion. Now, I mean, if it takes all of human history to get to 1.6 billion in 1900, and then you're quadrupling that in 1 century and going on from there, then you've got an intensity that you didn't have before. Furthermore, we went from being primarily rural people as human beings, as recently as in the last quarter of the 1800s, the majority of people lived in the countryside and in small towns and villages. Now, over half the people live in urban, dense urban areas, and that's going to intensify. So what you're describing as our reality, namely how do, with these numbers and these circumstances and this kind of impact on the planet, how do we manage to get along? There are things that are truly in our favor. One is that people, I kind of have emphasized that you can have a common experience and live in, next door to each other without necessarily changing the relationship to one another. But it's true humanly that we care more for the people who are close to us, and that matters. So we'll protect our family, or we'll protect our neighbors and our neighborhood, and because those ties of face-to-face and matter more to us than ties that are distant. And that's part of being human, and that's in our favor in these circumstances. But it remains the challenge to get everybody with their differences at the same table. And somehow we have to do that. I find it interesting these days that mayors are often at whatever their political party in the United States, whether they're Republican, Democrat, or Independent, mayors talk differently than people in Congress. Because they're up against these urban problems that need to be addressed, whatever their political affiliation. So Superstorm Sandy hits New Jersey and New York, and the Republican mayor, Bloomberg, starts to work on a plan for the exigencies. So this is kind of rambling, but I think the proximity of living in each other's presence and being in each other's space and facing common problems does hold promise, but it means getting together with our differences around the same table. And you see it happening with the sudden growth of the very thing that you're working on here, namely how on an interfaith basis do we come together. The difference in my earlier time at Union Seminary, and then I've been retired for 14 years and coming back now, is the growth, almost an explosion of assuming that we will only proceed on an interfaith basis from this point on. And that isn't simply a matter of everyone coming to the same point of goodwill out of their tradition. It's facing common issues, common problems, and realizing that we have to be at the same table together. So I find that hopeful. I find that promising. I think it's the traditions themselves can draw you that direction, as we talked about before. But it's the push of brute fact that is also going there. And what we have to come up with, and this is one of the biggest problems in religious ethics these days, is at the same time that you need to foster a global ethic, because we've entered this early Anthropocene, and we have common impacts of climate system change that require all working together. The Paris Peace Climate Accord is a huge step in that direction. At the same time that you need this global ethic, you can only get it by way of moral pluralism. You can't get there with a common global ethic, a common content. You have to respect and work from the traditions and the experiences of different peoples. And that's the big issue now, is both a global ethic and achieving it while yet respecting the integrity of different moral traditions.
This touches on so many issues again. One thing that immediately comes to mind is the criticism that non-Christian, non-Westerners have been leveling against the West, and many people in the West have brought this up, is that on the one hand, many scholars have been talking for a long time about the end of a grand narrative. We no longer have a grand narrative, and this is one of the problems, as it were, as far as bringing people together to work towards the greater good, as it were, whatever the project may be. On the one hand, we have this scenario which perhaps was brought about as a result of postmodernism, or was postmodernism more of a commentary on just the state of things as they were emerging in Europe, and now, of course, it's affecting, for better and for worse, the rest of the world. On the one hand, there's the end of the grand narrative. On the other hand, critics of the West, historically, what Western powers have done, is that they say that, well, the West, Europe, Christian Europe, as it were, has always had this tendency of placing these grand narratives over the rest of the world and saying, this is how things are.
Yeah.
Things are unfolding according to a particular Christian, Western Christian trajectory, and this is how we interpret the rest of the world, and this is how you will also interpret the rest of the world, whether consciously or unconsciously. But this is how the projects came about epistemologically, and so what we're facing now with the end of the grand narrative is, how do we create again perhaps a narrative or collection of narratives that speak to different peoples according to their own understanding of themselves and the rest of the world, the relationship to one another and so forth. And that seems to be a huge task, of course, and a question that I think about is, well, not how do we necessarily do this. I mean, on the one hand, yes, how do we do this? Is the task far too great for us? What is the role, in other words? We have the question of humanity, we have the question of ecology, and the third vital element in all this, as far as you're concerned, as far as I'm concerned as well, is that of theology. In other words, the role of God, or the divine, however, the Great Spirit, however we understand that to be. In other words, I can't help but think that grace has always played a major role, and will continue to play a major role, and therefore our role is to somehow remind ourselves of the ever-presence of grace in the world, and to somehow channel that, as it were, into the world. Would you care to comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, you've opened up so many important issues. One of the books that we've been reading in one of the classes at Union is Clive Hamilton's book, defiant Earth, the fate of humans in the Anthropocene. And one of his chapters in there says, grand narratives are dead until now. And he says, and then he calls for a new grand narrative because we've entered this rather unique moment in time. And what he means is that human beings do seem to require a story to live by. And they will have them one way or another. We all will. And he thinks because we have a common, that is, the whole planet is impacted by climate system change, that therefore we need some kind of story that takes account of that, and that centers our responsibility. If we're exercising these kinds of powers, how do we exercise them responsibly and not deflect our responsibility? From another quarter, and it's deeply religious, you've got a dialogue between what is now a common creation story that science provides us, from the Big Bang to the present, and then evolution with a big capital E there, evolution of the universe, and then evolution with a small e, the evolution of life on the planet. That is a grand narrative. I mean, that's a story where we can locate ourselves. And Passionist priest, Thomas Berry, working off being influenced by a paleontologist who was a priest, Teilhard de Chardin, says that grand narrative needs to be in dialogue with the grand narratives of religious traditions in working out what is a story that might be a common story now. So I'm just saying that there are people who say grand narratives aren't dead and we need a big story, but it has to be on the terms in which that grand narrative is not the source of conformity in a way that suppresses the stories that different peoples have lived by and do live by. So there is that dialogue is one that can happen and is happening. There's another angle on this, and it is what we talked about previously a little bit in terms of the search for a global ethic, which in some sense requires a grand narrative, and the respect for moral pluralism and multiple traditions and identities. That, again, there will never be just one we. So, and the way in which those two have come together, respecting difference and still establishing some kind of global ethic, is exemplified in what you see happening with a number of indigenous peoples around the world and their work at the UN. On the one hand, they say we must protect our indigenous wisdom and ways that's been under threat from a previous grand narrative that you described and continues to be under threat, not from religion so much as development, which is a grand narrative that industrial capitalism is the future as well as the past. So what many indigenous peoples have done is work for organizing among themselves and to be a presence on the national stage, chiefly, I think, through the United Nations as well as their own networking across lines. But they have also embraced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which applies to everybody. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a global ethic. And so you can get a combination. If, for example, the nations also subscribe to the economic and social rights that some of them do, or if in addition to that picked up on the Constitution of Bolivia and talked about biotic rights or the rights of nature, rights are a way of approaching a global ethic that then is universal in that it pertains to everybody and doesn't of itself extinguish the pluralism of different traditions and the ways, life ways of different traditions. So rights isn't exactly a grand narrative, but you have to have something that supports it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, was posited on one thing only, the dignity of the human person, and said everybody is worthy of acknowledgement. Their dignity is what is acknowledged. Or you could say all people are created equal. You don't mean that in any literal sense. We're obviously not. But it's a moral statement of equality. So I'm rambling now, but I think that the challenge is this challenge of plurality and pluralism, and to be is to be different. At the same time that we've got to find the way of the overarching commonality that we can also share. And that's the kind of global ethic, or that's the grand narrative, or that's the big story that we can live by. But we're a long ways from achieving that. The pressures will continue in that direction.
Thank you so much.
Good pressures.
When we come back, we'll in the final segment, we'll talk a little bit about the interrelationship between modern science in creating this singular grand narrative, as it were, and its connection to development projects, and how, to what extent it's both enabling or rather empowering people of other worldviews, as it were, and at the same time, how is it stifling traditional worldviews?
Yeah.